This is fifth in the series of the myth of Genesis and its Sumerian counterparts and how they weave together the same story, and you can tell that that's where they had taken it from. And until 150 years ago, we didn't know anything about this Sumerian civilization. Pretty much, it was itself a myth, and then now we find out it to be quite true. And so one could look at that as being something that's quite telling in itself. Everybody knows that the origin of the Bible, of course, comes from Sumerian area, the Eden area, and indeed they called their area Eden, and the garden and the fertility of the land was named such. So it shows you that. And of course, Abraham came from Ur, and he left because they apparently, right after the flood, had become idol worshippers, which almost makes no sense whenever some of these people, were on the boat itself, still probably alive, or at least with the elongated years they're given, were supposedly still alive. And Noah had only died just a few years before this point. So for them to have supposedly become just idol worshippers, well, I've told you before in another video that that's because it flooded again, and he said it never would happen again. And it did. And so this is your flood story woven into two different times. The ancient story of Utnapishtim comes from a story that's from older than that. They're localized floods, but they were devastating, and everybody lived right along the rivers, and whenever it massively floods, it killed everybody, cattle, all of the possibilities for food for that entire year, pretty much, all trapped under silt, just pretty much a ruin. And there's videos I've made about that too. In fact, the finding of the Great Flood there, which predates the one that we're trying to talk about when we talk about the one that apparently is discussed in the Bible itself. Now, in fact, the Garden of Eden story was probably authored around 500 BC as a discourse on ideals in life and the danger in human glory and the fundamentally ambiguous nature of humanity, especially human shortcomings or understandings. And if you look at the ancient story of Gilgamesh and the stories they have that are related to that, it gives you that same idea. He ends up losing his friend due to the frailty of life, though he and his friend kill Humbaba, and but due to his wounds, he succumbs to it, and because of such, he dies. And it also gives us a glimpse at the idea of heaven that's right there at that moment, whenever he brings him back, just whenever he thought he was dead, and he the birds that are around him he scares off, and they fly up, and he has this dream where he's been a bird himself, cloaked in darkness, and then the light all of a sudden opens up and all the birds fly off. And this goes back to an ancient bird cult that even is attached to Horus in Egypt, where they would take people and put them up on daises and let the birds, like buzzards, eat away at the carcass and take it up to heaven. From an old thing that comes back to, I can find reliefs in Kemyana Mohila that go back to 22,000 years, agreed upon, until they found these people with horses and mammoths and all these other things, and they tried to say the mammoth was a bull now, and you can look at it and it's got a trunk and everything onto it, and they'd already agreed to the idea. And of course, below that level, they found these other things that all of a sudden they didn't want to agree with anymore. And the scratch on the wall is a primordial type of linear A that people have deciphered, and it talks about An and Inanna and Utu, the sun god, and so on. And it shows you a ritual and a stairway to heaven that ironically shows up on all of the ancient Badarian ware that you see in ancient Egypt, which I've put into another video. But all of that is really more maybe for the correlation video I have going out of that. Let me see if I can get through this with you here, because Eden forms the first oceans and things like that. I believe I've talked through all of this and got to the point that I was talking about the snake that had actually stole the ancient plant here. So let's look at that. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero is given a plant whose name in Sumerian ends up being man who becomes young in old age. So, in other words, it makes you young again. It keeps putting you at 15. It's that idea of Adonis or whatever, and Peter Pan. And the original concept of the river of life, and also the original concept of the fountain of youth that people had looked for. And because in this tale they say that it was on the other side of the world in Gilgamesh's tale, that he had gone to the far side of the world where the sun, originates. So, and people back then thought it went through a gate and around the underworld. Well, if you went all the way around there, so Gilgamesh, I don't believe that he came to America, although it says kind of that if you knew the world was round, and there it was. And when they found America, they tried to find the fountain of youth because of that. And there was this plant that was supposed to give you the same effect that he had here. Now, the snake ate the plant, and it made the snake immortal. And as he walks off, he sheds his skin, right? And this is the idea that the snake had stolen from him the ability to become immortalish, if you will. And in the Garden of Eden, the same situation and symbology is there with this snake that caused you to not be immortal, right? Now, in the other Sumerian tale, Adapa, or Adamu, ends up going up to meet On because he's impressed because the wind, the south wind had knocked over his boat, and he cursed it, and it stopped the south wind for a while. So they were kind of impressed by that, and they went to go meet him. Now, Enki told him himself to dress in ragged clothes. Don't come in all cocky. That's not going to look too good to him. You have to humble yourself in front of gods. And he told him that he should be mourning for Dumuzi and Ningishita. And whenever he shows up, and tell them that that's why he looks so ragged and everything, that he's in mourning. And you want to throw dirt on yourself like people do. And he's like, oh man. So anyhow, supposedly he did this, and he flew up to heaven. There's a description of how the world gets small and so on. I believe I described it earlier. But so he goes up and he finally meets them. He comes into the great palace of Lapis Lazuli, and they're so impressed with him. Of course, when he first shows up, who meets him at the gates? But it's Dumuzi and Ningishita. Supposedly he doesn't know, and he tells them that he's mourning for them because they had both passed before, and they're in heaven now. And so they let him in, and they take him to On, and they're like, hey, check this dude out. And of course On had called for him in the first place, so it all seemed kind of neat. After speaking to him apparently at the meal, they were going to give him the food of life, just like Gilgamesh had looked for and searched for and everything off of it, and he turned it down because Enki had told him not to eat of the food that they offer him, because if it had pissed them off, they would give him the food of death, and he would die, and they would send him to the underworld, right? So this is your whole idea of going to meet somebody at the pearly gates, and whether or not you make it or not, concept, probably the first inclination of something along that line. And again, it's to Enki. Now, Enki is taken back to the first people that were snake worshippers. And if you look in the Bible, it's strange, but it mentions the fact that the serpent must walk on his stomach and everything. Now, do you believe in a modern society with the knowledge you know that before that time, supposedly, snakes were like walking or something? Or they had legs? Or were they already on their belly, and then he's forced to walk on their belly? Well, no, the difference there, people, is actually that he's telling mankind is like that special creature, that snake, that supposedly is immortal and does all these things, and you are more powerful. In fact, you don't wiggle along the ground, you stand up and walk upon it, right? It's more of a propping up thing, but it's kind of been twisted in the way the words have been written now, especially in your modern Bibles. You go back to the other ones, and you would read into it slightly differently to it. You look at the comparison exactly to the moment that they're speaking of in the Sumerian tales, and it'll come out to something more like what I'm talking about. Now, Eden is where God puts his Garden of Eden, which in the original stories of Enki, he builds in Dilmun, which is down on the Gulf area, and that's supposed to be the area of death. And if they go to Dilmun, there's all these primordial mounds that are there, and we haven't really messed with them too much, and thank God. And I don't think robbers have been into them too much, but again, it comes from the root meaning of fertility, Eden does, and the first man was to work in God's miraculously fertile garden. Now, this is exactly what goes on in Sumeria. But then the tree of life is a motif from Mesopotamian myths. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero's given that plant, and man becomes old, and it steals him from him. There's so much scholarly discussion about the type of knowledge given by the second tree. Here's where we were ending before. But a serpent steals the plant from him. There's been much scholarly discussion about it. Now, what is it? Well, suggestions include human qualities are being aware itself, sexual consciousness because they realized they were nude, and was that just it? I mean, there's been Jewish things and stuff written about it, ethical knowledge perhaps, or universal knowledge. And as we've crept through mankind in time here, this is the last one here, this universal knowledge is what's accepted, that we're supposed to have ended up gaining that. Of course, if you look at Enoch and a lot of the old books, we weren't supposed to get smart, we weren't supposed to have writing, lipstick, music, any of this stuff. It's like it came down with the angels that fallen and stuff, and Azazel and the things that were bad and stuff upon Mount Hermon. But that's a total another video, but if you know what I'm talking about. So in Eden, mankind has a choice between wisdom and life, and chooses the first, although the God intended them for the second. So in the story of Gilgamesh, he goes and finally meets who was Noah, who was given immortality. It's kind of strange, but in the Bible story, instead of getting immortality like in the story of the Akkadians and the Sumerians, he's actually turned into a drunk who's naked and curses his great-grandkid. You know, so it's not seen so flavorful with that, but of course that's supposed to preeminate what happens later, as if in 500 BC you weren't looking back already at stuff, and later whenever the rest of it's written you weren't looking back and saying you were a prophet. I could do that right now. I wrote a book 300 years ago, but it's about Lincoln. Anyhow, so all this discussion that's gone on shows you that, but it shows you that he has a choice between wisdom and life. Now, in the Gilgamesh story, he's given wisdom by the entire story that he goes through, but he's told that he doesn't have immortal life. And we know we don't have that. Well, now he also was given the chance at it, but he loses it. Adapa or Adamu does the same thing. This is your Adamic holotype that they have in the other stories. Now, the mythical Eden and its rivers may represent also the real Jerusalem, the temple in the promised land, which would have been back in Sumeria. And of course, there is at first a lot, and through the whole Bible, a whole problem with it. And this whole queen of heaven that ends up being the whore of Babylon. This idea of Venus, where she disappears at night and comes up in the morning, and she's been out all night. She's been hiding in the underworld, which at first in the stories is the concept of her searching for Dumuzi, where he had gone to the underworld, and she eventually brings him back in the spring, and this is the reason that fertility runs through the land every spring. This is your spring rites, and this is the reason for Easter and Ishtar and the way that that goes together. And we still celebrate all these things today, but it's all pulled in and it says it's the Bible. And Christmas is coming up too, and I've already done a few videos on that, and the three wise men and a lot of others, and I won't go into it with this. But so this Eden may represent the divine garden on Zion, the mountain of God, which also Jerusalem, while the real Gihon was a spring supposedly outside of the city of Jerusalem that they have. And people have found this spring, which there's no rain anymore, so the water table is so low it almost doesn't run anymore, but it was the sacred spring that they talk about a few times. And so mirroring the spring which waters Eden. Now this would have been supposedly where they thought all the water comes from, out of the mountains, right, and the origins where it came from, which leads up to Arata and Gobekli Tepe areas, But anyhow, the imagery of the garden with its serpent and the cherubs, which mocks Sumerians and their creatures that are anthropomorphic, has been seen as a reflection of the real images of the Solomonic temple too, with its copper serpent, the Nehushtan, and the guardian cherubs. But also in Sumeria, if you get kicked out of the gardens of Babylon, there would be a gate keeping you from there. We would have cherubs. Now where's this blinding sword that spins around and around on its own where nobody's holding it apparently? I think that was all taken out of conjunction too. Look at it in Hebrew sometime and you'll realize that like somebody didn't quite write that down right. It actually, you have to like speak like an ancient, pardon me, but an ancient American Indian in some type of broken English. Somebody has not put the correct words in there and the verb's out of place. It looks like there's supposed to be a word here, and it looks like this is maybe not what it originally said. But anyhow, there's too many of those in the Bible, hundreds of them, that people have noted over time, and all of a sudden there's a prose in there that's like, that doesn't fit the timeline. But now this echoes all of a Mesopotamian myth of the king as a primordial man, placed in a divine garden to guard the tree of life. And this is Mesopotamian, this is Sumerian, and you see this where they have their primordial gods, and even Horus and the air god, who was Enlil with the pine cone, which signifies the Christmas idea of the tree of life that stays alive even through the death of things, the perpetual carrying on, okay? And these two, Genesis 2, it's the only place in the Bible where Eden appears as a geographical location. Like elsewhere, maybe like in Ezekiel, it's a mythological place and it's supposedly up on a holy mountain, which really wouldn't grow a garden too well. But you know, maybe it's in this special valley, maybe it's actually, you know, Nirvana, or maybe it's, you know, one of those mythical valleys like the ones that's supposed to be for the Hindus, or up near the Himalayas. Anyhow, good and evil is a merism. It's basically trying to say almost, you know, basically everything. You know the difference between bad and good and pretty much how it all works now, whereas you didn't know before. It's almost like you became aware and you had this snap. In the Sumerian tale, they tell you of these people called the Afar, and apparently they were the dust of life that the things were made of too, because it talks about the Afar in the Bible as the dust that they make creatures out of. And apparently these Afar didn't get the upgrade where the Sumerians did, and they talk about some barbaric people that are around them and so on, and sometimes not in such a good light. And they say their knowledge is meager compared to these people who apparently got this spark that they, and if you look at Sumerian technology coming out of nowhere pretty much, it shows you somebody had a spark. But as we keep going, you know, this good and evil also may have a moral connotation. When God forbids the man to eat from the tree of knowledge, he says that if he does so, he's doomed to die. And it's kind of weird that he says it that way. And the Hebrew behind this is in the form used in the Bible for issuing death sentences. Like when they talk about somebody stoned to death, they die when somebody dies. So this is die. And I've had a lot of people try to say, oh no, that means that you were going to live forever first. Well, yeah, the tree of life and the thing and the idea. Now that's that Babylonian mythology, though. That's the Sumerian stuff you're talking about. But sure, yeah, you were supposed to get that, but you messed up and got the smarts instead. That's the idea. But then, you know, whoever got the other tree, well, On was going to offer both of them to you, but you pretty much ditched both of them, but you became smart through wisdom, is the concept they give you from it and everything. But, so there's more to that, though. Now, the first woman is created to be what's known as Ezer Kenegdo, and it also could be Eber Kenegdo, and Eber could be Hebrew, but it's a term that it's difficult to translate to the man, is what it comes out to be almost. And Kenegdo means alongside or opposite, a counterpart to him, or his chess piece, the yin to his yang, but yet the thing that was, and of course this reflects him being made from, the woman made from the man out of a rib, supposedly, that made from a magic tree, and because the talking snake told her to. But when we look at an illustrated, this God naming of the elements of the cosmos in Genesis illustrated his authority over creation. Now the man's naming of animals and women illustrates that Adam's had authority within creation, and that God had given man and imparted him with that. He's like, well, you know what? You go ahead and name some stuff, and that's the idea. And pretty much these Adamic people have been the one that have named everything, and all the continents and the oceans and most of the words and a lot of the derived language and the common language that people are using today, which once we find that we're unbabylizing ourselves supposedly from the Bible idea, that we're actually just going zoom with our technology, and it's incredible what we're learning. Once the world is becoming a much smaller place, we're finding out that some of this goes a little bit deeper than any of us probably originally ever thought. Now the woman is called Isha, which is woman, and it's got an explanation that comes with it that says it's because she was taken from Ish, which is man, and the two words are not really in fact connected, but kind of they are. Later, after the story of the garden is complete, she receives a new name, which is Hawa, and we know that is Eve. And of course this is Venus, who dips up in the morning. She's the morning star that comes up in the morning, but then the light comes out and she disappears. And then at nighttime she comes up and you see her and she disappears. She goes down, and then in the morning she comes back up, and then the light comes back up. So she's the lady of the evening, the lady in red, and all these little stories that come out of it. But it wasn't supposed to be like that. Now, of course, this ruins everything with people talking crap, if you will, and you get this idea that the goddess of love and fertility, which is what it shows you in the Greek too, is Diana and Venus, becomes the goddess of war. And indeed, through Aries, in the time of Aries, this lady was the conquesting, and what was on shields of most every different culture. It was a feminine thing, and there was women in religion quite a bit through that entire time, even at the times of Medusas and things being on the shields. But I digress totally. Let's continue with this. Now, later, after the story of the garden is complete, she receives that name of Eve. Now, this Eve, or Hawa, actually kind of means living in Hebrew, from a root that can also mean snake. So now you get that idea, and the idea that a woman is possibly the one that ruined everything, where she's also the snake that ruined everything. Now, the word traditionally translated as rib in English ends up being side or chamber or beam, and like beams are a rib in a ship, so it's along that concept. Now, a long-standing exegetical tradition holds that the use of a rib from a man's side emphasizes that both man and woman have equal dignity, for woman was created from the same material as man, shaped and given life by the same process. And medieval homilies about marriage and sacrament stated that Eve was made from a more noble material, the better half, than Adam. And this is where the reason that men don't have, they have one less rib and so on, is that it would have been taken from them. Of course, somebody looking at a skeleton comes up with these ideas, and you could end up easily formulating a concept like this. And it goes back to snake worship again. And of course, Enki. Now, Enki was the lord of the earth, right? And that's what Enki actually means. He was the lord of the earth first. In some of these Sumerian tales, he creates all the other gods. So he would have been the creator god that gets screwed over, just like a Titan situation, and who takes over as an air god, like a Zeus character, which is also Baal, which is also Zeus. And it almost like is weird, but they have this genre of one area going through the Trojan War, bad things happen, and then it goes through a different era, and you can tell almost everybody has the same thing. And I tell you, there's a reason for that. but I'll get to that in the reveal. See if I can get through this thing. It's already way up in the minutes. The meaning to be derived from the Genesis creation narrative will depend on the reader's understanding of its genre, the literal type from which it belongs. It makes an enormous difference whether the first chapters of Genesis are read as scientific cosmology, creation myth, or historical saga. It also makes a difference whenever you read it in the before 1611 versions of the Bible and the newer version, and if you were to read the translated Old Hebrew on it also. A misunderstanding of this genre of the text, or meaning the intention of the authors and the culture within they wrote, will result in a misreading quite often. Reformed evangelical scholar Bruce Waltke cautions against one such misreading, the woodenly literal approach, which leads to creation science and such implausible interpretations as the gap theory and the presumption of a young earth and denial of evolution and saying the world's only 6,000 years old from now, and all these things that people come up with now. It's odd we still kind of have that. But another scholar, Conrad Heyer, sums up the same misleading and unworkable because it proposes and insists upon a kind of literature and intention that was not there. Whatever else it may be, Genesis 1 is a story since it features characters, characterization, a narrator, and a dramatic tension expressed through a series of incidents arranged in time. Now, the priestly author of Genesis, or known as P, had to confront two major difficulties. First, there's the fact that since only God exists at this point, no one is available to be the narrator, and the storyteller solved this by introducing an inobtrusive third-person narrator, that guy that we're familiar with quite often whenever you watch nature shows and things. Second, there was a problem of conflict. Now, conflict is necessary to arouse the reader's interest in the story, yet with nothing else existing and no little war they could have, neither a chaos monster nor another god, there cannot be any conflict. So this was solved by creating a very minimal tension. God is opposed by the nothingness itself, the blank of the world without form and void. Now, telling the story in this way was a deliberate choice. There was a number of creation stories in the Bible, but they tend to be told in the first person by wisdom, by the instrument by which God created the world. The choice of an omniscient third-person narrator in Genesis narrative allows the storyteller to create the impression that everything is being told and nothing is being held back. Now, it can also be regarded as ancient history and ancient science, and people could misread that concept there. In the words of E.A. Spicer, on the subject of creation, biblical tradition aligned itself with the traditional tenets of Babylonian science. The opening words of Genesis 1, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," sum up the author's belief that Yahweh, God of Israel, was solely responsible for creation and had no rivals. But later Jewish thinkers adopted ideas from Greek philosophy, concluded that God's wisdom, word, and spirit, the original Trinity concept, penetrated all things and gave them unity. Now, also looking back too at the very origin of this thing, where God is really meant to give form and meaning to things, really in most of these Mesopotamian and Middle Eastern myths. And indeed, even in the Hebrew concept, it doesn't really have that flavor of that he whipped up everything until later. Now, so Christianity in turn adopted these ideas and identified Jesus with the creative word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, John 1:1. When the Jews came into contact with Greek thought, it led to a major reinterpretation of the underlying cosmology of the Genesis narrative. The biblical authors conceived the cosmos as a flat disc-shaped earth in the center, an underworld for the dead below, and a heaven above. Below the earth were the waters of chaos, the cosmic sea, home to mythic monsters defeated and slayed by God. In Exodus 24, God warns against making an image of anything that is in the waters under the earth. There are passages which tell you that he killed Leviathan and fed it to the people of the wilderness. And so these would have been your afar, pretty much, supposedly, too. Now, there are also waters above the earth, and so the rakia, or firmament, a solid bowl, was necessary to keep them from flooding the world. Now, during the Hellenistic period, this was largely replaced by a more scientific model as imagined by Greek philosophers, according to which the earth was a sphere at the center of concentric shells and of spheres containing the sun, the moon, and the stars. Why the hell would that happen? There we go. Well, it tried to load something else. Can I get control back? Thank you. So, according to the model of the Greek or Hellenistic idea, the earth was a sphere at the center of concentric shells of celestial spheres containing the sun, the moon, and the stars and the planets. Looks very much like, oh, where's that damn picture at? It doesn't show it anymore. Okay, but it showed the shells, and I'm sure you may have seen this before, but also they knew the world was round. Back at like 300 BC, Eratosthenes heard a story that on the longest day that there was a spire way down in Aswan that didn't cast any shadow. Up in Alexandria, he noted that on that same day it did cast a shadow, and realizing the difference between the two, and knowing that they were supposed to be plumb straight up and down, he had somebody walk the difference, which was like a 500 of their measurements there, which was like leagues, or no, it was stadia. And so in that, he divided into it, and the amount of degree of shadow that he saw after playing around with models a little bit, and he said that that was 7 degrees, therefore the earth was around 40,000 miles around in circumference, or 250,000 stadia, which actually ends up being real close, just within a couple hundred miles of exactly true. So they already had a center of the earth model, and it was round. This whole idea people try to play off where like they thought you were going to fall off the end of the earth, that's another allegorical story that doesn't have really any basis to it unless you believe the flat earth model, which a lot of people then, and even sadly some now, still believe. Now, the idea that God created the world out of nothing, which is creatio ex nihilo, is central today to Islam, to Christianity, and to Judaism. Indeed, the medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides felt it was the only concept that the three religions actually shared that were exactly factual out of any of the three. Yet, it's not found directly in Genesis, nor in the entire Hebrew Bible. The priestly authors of Genesis 1 were concerned not with the origins of matter, the material from which God formed into the habitable cosmos, but with assigning roles set that the cosmos would function. Indeed, as children of Adam, one was to play on the fields, one was to do this, and the reason things got screwed over is that you killed this one. This guy started attacking the hunter-gatherers, or the people that were farmers. The farmers were more docile. It's the original coming together of Sumerians, but that's also in the reveal here. Now, this was still the situation in the early 2nd century AD, although early Christian scholars were beginning to see a tension between the idea of world formation and the omnipotence concept of God. And by the beginning of the 3rd century, this tension was resolved, and by the Council of Nicaea, they already had it kind of aired out there. Now, world formation was overcome, and the creation ex nihilo became a fundamental tenet of Christian theology, and it still comes to this day. Here are sources and the citations. Again, we have a reveal coming after this, which really just puts this all together, and people that have a good amount of intelligence to themselves have probably got it already pretty well figured out. but they're probably just like the revealed talking through here. There's a lot that people have not quite seen or quite thought of yet. I miss things all the time too. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. And again, part 1 should be up in the corner. Part 5 will be down below as soon as it comes out. Until then, it's going to be the one right before this. Peace.